Hello friends, I'm Konrad and welcome to Bad Guy Breakdowns, the series where we look at the most iconic villains to grace the silver screen. Today we're looking at everyone's favourite Lienz Cossack, a guy who's probably in the top 3 longest surviving characters Sean Bean has ever played, the MI6 agent with a silver tongue and a burned up face. It's your friend and mine, Alec 006 Trevelyan. Alec Trevelyan is introduced to us as another 00 agent on a mission with James Bond, the aim of which is to sabotage a Soviet chemical weapons facility in Archangel. And although the audience has never met him, Jeffrey Kane and Bruce Firestein's screenplay immediately makes it clear that Trevelyan and Bond have worked together multiple times before. Their familiar dialogue and the chemistry between Pierce Brosnan and Sean Bean implying a sense of fraternity and mutual respect for one another's skill sets that will be crucial in establishing Trevelyan as a viable villain.
James? For England.
For England, Alec.
What seems like your typical get in, kill some people, blow up a thing and get out kind of mission rapidly goes south when the two MI6 agents are rumbled by Colonel Arkady Urmov, more on him later, with 006 doing the only effective firearm work we see from him in the whole movie before being captured off screen. Alright, now, whatever you do, Alec, don't shout anything that gives away which country we come from, or M is going to kill us.
3, 2, for England, James!
For fuck's sake! 006's apparent execution leads Bond to cut the detonation time on the explosive-rigged chemical tanks and sneak his way out behind just the squeakiest little cargo dolly you ever did see. Just listen to that thing. Those guards deserve a promotion just for keeping straight faces. I am sure they'll have a good laugh about this one later. Well, except for that guy, I guess. Jesus, Urmov. Bond does what he is wont to do, steals a motorbike, then a plane, and makes good his escape just as the facility goes kaboom, giving Alec Trevelyan the fiery on-job cremation he had always wanted. Spoiler alert! It did not! As it turns out, this was all an elaborate ruse to fool British intelligence and probably a few annoying friends that Trevelyan just wanted to cut ties with into thinking that their former agent was dead, so that he could begin a decade-long plan to exact revenge against the United Kingdom. Why, you ask? Well, Trevelyan's parents were Lienz Cossacks, anti-Bolsheviks who really weren't big fans of the Soviet Union and actively fought against them right up until the end of the Second World War, when the British Army forcibly repatriated about 30,000 of them to the Soviets, despite promising to look after them. Many of them, Trevelyan's parents included, chose to kill themselves rather than face the retribution of Stalin, which is odd as he was such a famously forgiving dictator. Still, by 1946, little Alec was down a family and looking for some purpose, and via life's little ironies, ended up moving to England and going to work for MI6, with the routine background checks turning up his past, but those in charge deciding he probably didn't remember his parents' traumatic betrayal and brutal deaths. Sure hope those guys got fired for that blunder. Just kidding, Trevelyan almost certainly had them killed. Now, I can hear some of you wondering, wait, he was alive in 1945 but was played by Sean Bean, a 36-year-old actor, both before and after the fall of the Soviet Union, which happened in 1991. And yes, that's correct. During the casting for Goldeneye, the producers had initially conceived of Trevelyan as an older, mentor-like figure for Bond, and had considered the likes of Anthony Hopkins for the role. But after some careful consideration, they decided they would rather go with a younger actor and just ignore the inconsistencies in time period and the age of Bean, which explains how a 36-year-old actor can end up playing someone who is, at youngest, 46, and in reality probably closer to his mid-50s by the time the main plot of the movie rolls around. The former 006 is reborn as the mysterious Janus, the head of a Russian crime syndicate who spends the years leading up to and immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union engaging in fun little activities like supplying guns to the Iraqis during the First Gulf War. Between arms deals, he made friends with a handful of heavies, including former KGB agent, assassin, fighter pilot and owner of frighteningly powerful thighs, Xenia Onatop, and the guy who really only exists to hold a gun and get the rest of the Janus syndicate into cool Russian parties, former Colonel, now General Arkady Urumov. Trevelyan demonstrates a flair for the dramatic with his choice of codename, Janus being the two-faced Roman god of doors and transitions. He himself being a man caught between two countries, albeit decidedly on one side rather than the other by the time we catch up with him in the mid-90s. And as if the symbolism of the name weren't plain enough, we are also treated to this duplicitous theming being borne out in numerous minor details in the movie. His facial scarring is a clear nod to his possession of two identities, and here comes a great joke, a little on the nose that he's lucky didn't get blown off in that explosion as far as visual metaphors go. Nailed it! Though it does tie quite neatly back into his animosity towards Bond, really the only justification for a personal rivalry between them that we ever get. And early on in the movie we see Xenia and a masked Urumov steal a bleeding-edge, EMP-proof attack helicopter from the French military after making use of a pleasure yacht called the Manticore. Manticores being a mythical beast with the head of a human, body of a lion and tail of venomous spikes, or a scorpion stinger depending on who you ask. Admittedly, it's not two faces this time, but it's another example of a creature being made of multiple disparate parts. The mysterious Janus exists merely as a shadow who operates through his more hands or indeed legs on henchmen, until about halfway through the movie when Bond comes face to face with his old friend in a scrapyard full of so many partially deconstructed statues of old communist icons that there's barely enough room for the rampant symbolism. Here, these two relics of the Cold War engage in the kind of witty repartee that makes Trevelyan such a classic villain, before 007 gets the old sleep dart to the neck so he can be blown up in a frankly overcomplicated missile-based death scene. Bond meets Natalia, the only living person not on Trevelyan's side who knows the location of the second Goldeneye satellite, and therefore someone they really should have made sure was dead, and in typical Bond fashion, they both escape in the nick of time before heading off after the villains. We next catch up with them when Bond and Natalia are taken into the relative protection of Russian custody, only for Urumov to go into business for himself and stage an escape.
Russia may have changed, but the penalty for terrorism is still death.
What's the penalty for forgetting to turn on the CCTV cameras in the interrogation room out of interest? Boy, that is unfortunate. After some chasey, shooty, Urumov takes Natalia prisoner, again not killing her instantly, instead leading Bond and his new T-55 tank through numerous St. Petersburg buildings directly to Trevelyan and his cool train. Trevelyan ticks the sexual weirdo box for his character by getting handsy with Natalia while also implying that he and Bond shared sexual partners all the time. Alec once again fails to kill the one person who can foil his plans before losing his right-hand man, as the Russian general briefly has second thoughts about his choice of friends before being introduced to the business end of an AK-47. Trevelyan and Xenia travel by helicopter, or submarine, or something to Cuba despite presumably being wanted criminals in most of the Western world and probably Russia too. Once there, they somehow convince a base full of computer programmers and soldiers loyal to the Russian government that they should listen to the crazy lady in the skin-tight leather and the man from Sheffield about who they should fire the satellite superweapon at. Listen, it's not important, the former 006 is charming as hell, I would listen to him, as would you. Bond is caught and Trevelyan finally gets an opportunity to monologue at the annoyingly persistent secret agent about his own origin and his plan to send England back to the Stone Age via an EMP attack on London. He is, rather reasonably I have to say, accused of having a pretty bloodless and tame plan for someone who wants to get back at the country who betrayed his parents and led to their deaths. And this is a running thing with Alec Trevelyan, who ends up being one of the more passive Bond villains, relying instead on his henchmen to do almost all of the violence he ends up inflicting. And it's never more clear that poor old Alec is a little out of practice when it comes to murder when he and Bond get their final confrontation, pursuing one another across the scaffolding around the enormous Goldeneye satellite station, engaging in some solid fist-fighting before Trevelyan is finally bumped off in pretty spectacular fashion, and we'll get back to that later. Alec Trevelyan, from introduction to death, is a character who is largely defined and remembered by his dialogue and Sean Bean's performance. He is presented as someone who can go toe-to-toe with Bond in both hand-to-hand combat and witty repartee, and the several scenes where the two of them share screen time are among the most quotable in the whole film series.
Bond. Only Bond.
But how was he as an actual practical bad guy? Let's find out as we get into the breakdown. Trevelyan's plan was, all told, pretty solid. Steal a high-tech helicopter, stage a terrorist attack on a superweapon facility in Russia to cover the fact that you've actually stolen the keys to the identical facility in Cuba, fire an EMP satellite at London, steal a bunch of money and enjoy the sweet, sweet taste of revenge. It falls down in the in-between parts of these steps where he repeatedly made the same mistake over and over again. Namely, not killing Natalia. If Natalia had died anywhere before she was able to point Bond at the second Goldeneye facility in Cuba, this movie would have ended with London looking like the Purge and James Bond in a Russian prison accused of extranational terrorism. He could have killed her when Xenia and Boris took her hostage. He could have killed her and Bond when both were taken prisoner in the statue park. And perhaps most egregious of all, Ourumov could have killed her at any point during their escape from the Ministry of Defence and subsequent tank chase and train sequences. For the love of Christmas, just put a bullet in her and be done with it. What is wrong with you people? And listen, I know this is a Bond film and you can't just shoot James Bond in the head while he's unconscious, but when the entire success of Trevelyan's plan could be all but guaranteed by simply killing Natalia the moment they caught her, I have to ding them for it. So, was the plan good? Yes, but it was let down in its execution. Whose fault is that? Well, a villain is only as effective as the help they hire. So let's have a closer look at the muscle behind the main menace. Xenia is introduced racing Bond in a Ferrari. We catch up with her smouldering at a baccarat table opposite him before she crushes an admiral to death with her thighs mid-coitus later that night. It is a strong start. She performs basically all of the grunt work for Trevelyan. She kills the pilots of the super helicopter before flying it herself, and she manages to find joy in her work, which is just such an important quality in a henchman. Listen, say what you want about the safety of this, but that level of enthusiasm is admirable. She is the MVP of the Janus Syndicate, which makes it a real shame when her final fight with Bond ends so anticlimactically. After our hero crash lands close to the Goldeneye base in Cuba, she descends from a helicopter to finish him off. A few kicks, a cheeky face lick, followed by some good old-fashioned thigh crushing, and it looks like he might be done for. But the interference from Natalia is enough to distract Xenia, allowing Bond to grab her gun, shoot the helicopter she's still attached to by a rope, and see her crushed against a tree. A pretty weak death for a great heavy. You may have noticed that we haven't really mentioned Alan Cummings' Boris Grushenko yet here, and that's mainly because in the grand scheme of things he offers very little to the Janus Syndicate. It can be assumed that he helped Xenia and Ourumov into the Severnaya facility, but this aside, his main contributions are giving Natalia the incredibly important password hint for his spike program, and getting frozen with liquid nitrogen in what is undoubtedly the best death in the whole movie. Why is there a bunch of liquid nitrogen stored in tanks right next to the open plan operations center for a weapons platform satellite? Doesn't matter, because through it we get the catharsis of this 4chan posting motherfucker shouting about how he's invincible seconds before being put on ice permanently. General Ourumov is like that one friend you grew up with who was cool when you were 8, but now you're 25 and he's kind of a fuck up, and frequently posts embarrassing stuff in the group chat. But the last time you tried to get rid of him, his mum ended up phoning you, so now you have to put up with him. Except Ourumov is also a general who is in charge of super weapons, drinks on the job, and is incapable of shooting anyone who doesn't work for him, no matter how useful it might be if he did. Yes, I'm still angry about Natalia. His main achievement, as far as Trevelyan is concerned, is getting them in the door at Severnaya, which, let's be fair, is kind of essential as far as the plan goes, but beyond that, he is effectively useless. And as the old saying goes, you live by the shitty sword, you die by the shitty sword. A lifetime of poor decisions catch up with old Arcady in the end, when he is granted about 3 frames worth of screen time in which to die before the movie asks that you forget he ever existed. However, However, it's fair to say that if Urumov is guilty of not shooting when he should, it's only because he learned it from watching Trevelyan. Let's see how 006 gets on when it comes to inflicting lethal violence. Our man Alec does very little actual murdering in Goldeneye. So little in fact that it's a small miracle that he comes across as competent at all. Let's see how his kill total racks up. He shoots one unsuspecting scientist in the back during his and Bond's ingress into the Archangel weapons facility, a brief moment of unnecessary violence foreshadowing his turn to the dark side. During the shit has gone sideways sequence, he drops 2 guards with his silenced pistol as they burst through a door, then kills a further 4 soldiers when he trades up for an assault rifle before being subdued. And that's it! 6 nameless grunts and a scientist during the opening sequence are the only kills that Trevelyan manages to get under his belt. Although honourable mention goes to the final showdown with Bond, where he was one implausibly bulletproof wire fence away from putting the hero down multiple times. Seriously, what is up with that thing? Is there a force field between the links or something? Regardless, it's now time to have a look at that final confrontation in a little more detail. If Bond villains can be relied upon to do one thing well, it's dying, and Trevelyan is right up there with the best of them in this regard. Combining the scintillating dialogue that makes their relationship so captivating, a brilliantly choreographed fight sequence, and an infinitely quotable final exchange, 006 goes out on top. By which we of course mean that he actually goes out underneath the burning wreckage of a satellite dish. Let's have a look at his final moments. First things first, Trevelyan demonstrates his penchant for badassery by immediately deciding to get rid of Bond himself. His hand isn't really forced, he still has some soldiers available to him, he has just had enough of his old friend's bullshit for one day. Credit to him for being proactive. The two of them race around the transmitter with Trevelyan almost ventilating Bond a number of times before pulling the old slasher movie disappearing act after being tossed down a set of metal stairs. Trevelyan sneak attacks Bond from behind and then channels the spirit of equilibrium as the two men wrestle for a gun with some awesome close quarters fighting before Bond, coward that he is, escapes Trevelyan's clutches by extending a ladder at the base of the transmitter dish before his nemesis can make good on his claim.
You know, James, I was always better.
It's worth pointing out here that according to Sean Bean, both he and Brosnan did the vast majority of their own stunts in this movie, which makes this fight sequence all the more impressive. Both of these guys really look like they're beating the absolute shit out of each other, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Trevelyan makes the smart play and calls in a helicopter gunship for backup, but loses focus at the crucial moment, leading to the immortal line,
For England, James?
No. For me.
Being the hard-as-nails former super spy that he is, Trevelyan is still semi-alive until a few moments later when the Goldeneye transmitter dish explodes and collapses on top of him, something it wouldn't actually do until 26 years later in 2021. Unclear whether Sean Bean was under it this time though. So, how does 006 measure up in the pantheon of evildoers? I think his dialogue and performance is top-notch. He's slimy and cool and comes across as dangerous despite getting other people to do his dirty work for him most of the time. If there is a glaring flaw, it's that he and his cronies suffer from a terminal case of the stupids. Not killing Natalia at any of the multiple opportunities they had to do so is an enormous fuck-up, and one they should all be embarrassed about. But ultimately, you can't argue with the guy's legacy. He remains one of the most memorable and beloved villains in the Bond series, and with good reason, I think. Especially if you look at the bad guys who followed him in the Brosnan era. I seriously could not tell you one thing about Jonathan Pryce's character in Tomorrow Never Dies, and the less said about Rick Yoon's diamond-faced gimmick in Die Another Day, the better. Next time, we'll be looking at Harry Powell's menacing preacher in the classic horror movie The Night of the Hunter. I've been Konrad, and I'll see you next time.